of balance now, and so that warrants a change in policy.
Colby Smith with the New York Times. Should we be viewing today's cut as the committee taking out some insurance against the possibility that the labor market is at risk of weakening? Or is it the committee's view that the dynamics of a downturn are already in place? I guess I'm just trying to square the shift in the rate forecast in the SEP towards more cuts than just 3 months ago, with the fact that the forecast for unemployment didn't change.
Yeah, I think you could think of this in a way as a risk management cut, because if you look at the SEP, actually, the projections for growth this year and next actually ticked up just a little bit, and inflation and unemployment didn't really move much. So what's different now? What's different now is that you see a very different picture of the risks to the labor market. You've seen, we were looking at 150,000 jobs a month at the time of the last meeting, and now we see the revisions and we see the new numbers. And I don't want to put too much emphasis on payroll job creation, but it's just one of the things that suggests that the labor market is really cooling off, and that tells you that it's time to take that into account in our in our policy.
So just looking at the SEP once again, the median participant has inflation higher than previously expected by the end of next year, and the Fed not getting back to the 2% target until 2028. So I guess I'm just wondering how you characterize the risk to price pressures of kicking off a series of cuts at this point.
Yeah, so I would look at it this way. We fully understand and appreciate that we need to remain fully committed to restoring 2% inflation on a sustained basis, and we will do that. At the same time, we've got to weigh the risks to the two goals. And I would say since April, to me, the risks of higher and more persistent inflation have probably become a little less. And that's partly because the labor market has softened, GDP growth has slowed. So I would just say that the risks there have been less than one might think. And in terms of the labor market, what we're seeing is unemployment is still low. It's still a relatively low rate, but we're seeing downside risks.
Michael McKee from Bloomberg Radio and Television. I'm a little confused by your explanation of the Fed cutting rates because of unemployment. If you think that most of what's happening in the employment area is related to immigration, which your rate cuts wouldn't address, how do you see that as more important than inflation, which has remained almost a full percentage point above your target?
Well, I was saying that what's happening in the labor market has more to do with immigration than it has to do with tariffs. That was the question I was answering. So I wouldn't say that all of what's happening in the labor market is due to tariffs. I mean, you clearly have a slowing in it due to immigration. You clearly have a slowing in demand, which is now perhaps more than that in supply, and we know that because the unemployment rate has ticked up. So, that's what I meant by that.
I think a follow-up. Every year since 2015, the SEP has forecast that you would hit your target 2 years later. And this year, this SEP says you're going to hit your target 2 years later. 2% does not seem to be in sight. Does that suggest that the 2% target is not really achievable? And does this present any credibility problems for you in telling people?
You know, that's literally how you put the projections together. You're writing down a rate path, which is designed to create, over the course of the SEP, time frame, 2% inflation and maximum employment too. So that's all that is. No one really knows where the economy will be in 3 years, but the nature of the exercise is to write down policy that you believe would return to the 2% goal over at least by the end of the exercise.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth Schulze with ABC News. The latest inflation report shows that prices are still going up across key categories for many households, including groceries. What will the Fed do if prices pick up more?
So our expectation, and you can see this consistently through the year, has been that inflation will move up this year, but that basically because of the effects on goods prices from tariffs, but that those will turn out to be a one-time price increase as opposed to creating an inflationary process. That's been our forecast pretty much all the individual forecasts say that. We can't just assume that, though, right? We have to, our job is literally to make sure that that is what happens, and we will do that job. Right now, the situation we're in is that we see inflation, we continue to expect it to move up, maybe not as high as we would have expected it to move up a few months ago. The pass-through of the tariffs into inflation has been slower and smaller. The labor market has softened. So the case for there being a persistent inflation outbreak is less. And so that's why we think it's time for us really to acknowledge that the risks to the other mandate have grown and that we should move in the direction of neutral. So what will we do? We'll do what we need to do, but we have two mandates and we try to balance them. For a long time, our framework says that when our two goals are in tension, and this is quite an unusual situation, how do we decide what to do? Because our tools can't do two things at once. What we do is we ask which is farther from, how far is each from the goal and how long is it expected to get to the goal? So, and then we think about those things and we see, as I mentioned, our policy had been really skewed toward inflation for a long time, really. Now we see that there's downside risk clearly in the labor market, and so we're moving in the direction of more neutral policy.
How concerned are you about the slowdown in the jobs market for households at home, especially younger Americans struggling to land a job?
So it's an interesting labor market, and obviously we think it's appropriate that we reduce our rates so that we become more neutral, which presumably will be better for the labor market. You see people who are sort of more at the margins, so kids coming out of college and younger people, minorities are having a hard time finding jobs. The overall job finding rate is very, very low. However, the layoff rate is also very low. So you've got a low firing, low hiring environment, and the concern is that if you start to see layoffs, the people who are laid off there won't be a lot of hiring going on. So that could very quickly flow into higher unemployment. In a healthier economy, healthier labor market, there would be jobs for those people. But now the hiring rate is very, very low. So that's been a growing concern over the last few months. And it's one of the reasons why we think it's appropriate that we begin to shift our policy focus toward a more balanced one.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Mr. Chair, in the past, during rate cuts, you used the word recalibration. And I wonder if you pointedly did not use it this time. And in fact, when you said policy is not on a preset course, did you mean that as sort of the opposite of recalibration? Are we meeting to meeting, data point by data point? Are we in the process here of getting back to neutral? Thank you.
So I think we're in a meeting by meeting situation. We're going to be looking at the data. You know what, let me say a word about the SEP really here. So we often point this out. What the SEP is it's an accumulation of the individual projections of 19 people, showing what they believe at a particular moment in time to be the most likely path for the economy and thus the appropriate path for monetary policy as well. And as you know, we don't debate or try to agree on what that is. We just write them down and accumulate them. We do sometimes discuss them. And so we always say we're not on a preset path, and we really mean that. The actual decisions we make are going to be based on the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks at the time the decisions are actually made. So you will have seen that we have 10 participants out of 19 who wrote down 2 or more cuts for the remainder of the year, and 9 who wrote down fewer than, in fact, in a good number of cases, no more cuts. So rather than looking at this as certainty, I would encourage people, as always, to look at the SEP as through the lens of probability. And so there are different possible outcomes and likelihoods rather than this one is certain and this one isn't happening. So that's what I would say.
Thank you for getting to my follow-up question, which was, is the dispersion in the outlook a sign of uncertainty of policy in the meetings to come? Thank you.
You know, it is such an unusual situation. Ordinarily, when the labor market is weak, inflation is low. And when the labor market is really strong, that's when you got to be careful about inflation. So we have a situation where we have two-sided risk. And that means there's no risk-free path. And so it's quite a difficult situation for policymakers. And it's not at all surprising to me that you have a range of views. It's not so much about having different views for the path of the economy, but it's partly that. But it's also partly about what's the right thing to do in light of the tension between the two goals. How do you weight them? How worried are you about one versus the other? And so it's natural. I think it would actually be surprising if you didn't have a pretty wide range of views based, in this kind of highly unusual situation, and we do. So, but we get together, we discuss, we have a great discussion, and then we decide what to do and we act. But you're right that it's a wide dispersion of views, and I think that's understandable and natural in the current situation.
Hi, Victoria Guida with Politico. You've talked a lot about Fed independence and the importance of it over the years, but as markets have questions about what exactly President Trump's intentions are with the Fed, what would you point to as the things they should be watching?
भैया ये शेयर तो रॉकेट है वैसे कन्विक्शन तो है पर भैया
The economic outlook rather than political considerations.
Look, it's deeply in our culture to do our work based on the incoming data and never consider anything else. That's just everybody who's at the Fed really feels strongly about that way. So, you'll know it by the way we talk about what we're doing, by the speeches that people give, by the decisions that we make. You'll know that we're just still going to do that. That's all we do. And we don't frame these questions at all or see them in terms of political outcomes. I think when you get to another part of Washington, everything is seen through the lens of, does it help or hurt this political party, this politician? That's the framework. And I think people find it hard to believe that is not at all the way we think about things at the Fed. We're taking a longer perspective. We're trying to, serve the American people as best we can. So I think you would be able to tell. I don't believe we'll ever get to that place. I would say we're doing our work exactly as we always have now, and they're making their arguments, and we're having really a great discussion around these challenging issues. So.
Do you see the court case around Lisa Cook as being related to questions of Fed independence?
I see it as a court case that it would be inappropriate for me to comment on.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Edward Lawrence from Fox Business. So we saw the preliminary benchmark revisions down 911,000. The revisions for June were the first negative revisions we've seen since December of 2020. How can the Fed base important decisions on rate and what to do with the interest rates on data that seems to be, as you've called it in the past, noisy?
So on the QCEW, the revision that we saw was almost exactly what we expected. It was amazing how close the expectation was. So, and the reason for that is, for the last bunch of quarters, there's been almost a predictable overcount. And I think the Bureau of Labor Statistics really does understand this, and they're working hard to fix it. It's got to do, of course, it has something to do with low response rates, but it's also got to do with what's called the birth-death model, because a good amount of I think the economy is moving along. Economic growth is going to be 1.5% or better this year, maybe a little better. Forecasts have been coming up, as you can see. So labor market unemployment is low, but downside risks, but it's still a low unemployment rate. So that's how we see it.
Hi, Stephanie Rule, MSNBC. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said that the Federal Reserve suffers from mission creep and institutional bloat. He's now calling for an independent review. Would you support an independent review, or are you open to any sort of reform in any areas of the Fed?
I, of course, am not going to comment on anything the Secretary says, or really any other officer says. So in terms of reform at the Fed, we just went through a lengthy and I think very successful process of updating our monetary policy framework. I would say there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes around the assets we have in the Federal Reserve Bank system, Federal Reserve system, and at the board. Are they the right size? We're actually going through a 10% 10% headcount reduction through the whole Fed, including the board and all the reserve banks. The employment at the Fed at the end of that will be basically at the same level it was more than 10 years ago. So we will have had zero job growth for more than a decade when we're finished with that, and I think we'll probably do more than that. So I think we're certainly open to constructive criticism and ways to do our jobs better.
But not an independent review?
We're certainly open to to always trying to do better.
Mr. Chairman, Neil Irwin with Axios. There's been some debate lately on whether AI is already starting to affect the labor market in terms of lower labor demand, higher productivity by contrast. Do you buy that? And if that is true, does that have implications for the monetary policy setting?
So there's great uncertainty around that. I think my view, which is also a bit of a guess, but widely shared, I think, is that you are seeing some effects, but it's not the main thing driving it. And so particular focus on young people coming out of college. And yeah, there may be something there. It may be that companies or other institutions that have been hiring younger people right out of college are able to use AI more than they had in the past. That may be part of the story. It's also part of the story, though, that job creation more broadly has slowed down. The economy has slowed down. And so it's probably a number of things. But yeah, it's probably a factor. Hard to say how big it is.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. What evidence do you see of tariffs showing up in inflation?
Well, if you can take goods, just sort of the broad goods category, and last year, goods inflation was negative. If you go back 25 years, that was the typical thing, was that goods inflation was, goods prices generally went down, even adjusting for quality. So that was not the case during the pandemic, of course. Goods inflation went very high, but we had essentially returned to zero or slightly negative inflation. Now, I think goods inflation over the course of the past year is 1.2%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a big change. So we think, I mean, analysts have different views, but we think it's contributing, 0.3 or 0.4 or something like that to the current core PCE inflation reading, which is 2.9%. So it's contributing. What seems to be happening is that, the tariffs are mostly not being paid by exporters, mostly being paid by really the companies that sit between the exporter and the consumer. So if you buy something and you sell it through retail or you use it to make a product, you're probably taking a lot of those costs on and not able to pass it fully along to the consumer yet. That appears to be what we're seeing. All of those companies and entities in the middle, they'll tell you that they have every intention of passing that through in time, but they're not doing that now. To the consumer, the pass-through has been pretty small. It's been slower and smaller than we thought. But the evidence is it's very clear that there's some pass-through.
I also wanted to ask if you could share with us the conditions under which you might consider leaving the Fed in May.
I have nothing new on that for you today.
Hi, Katerina Saraiva with Bloomberg News. I just wanted to follow up on one of your answers just a couple minutes ago. We've often heard you talk about how you and your colleagues, do not think about politics. This does not enter the room. But one of your new colleagues does come from this world, right, where everything is seen through this framework of politics and of what party is being helped, and that person is still employed by the White House. How can markets and the public interpret, some of his speeches, for example, and then some of, the forecasts that we see today? I mean, the median for this year was moved because of the introduction of his forecast. I'm talking about the number of rate cuts seen this year. What do you say to markets and the public that are trying to interpret, what you guys are saying?
So there's 12 vote, 19 participants of whom 12 vote, as you know, on a rotating basis. So no one voter, can really, the only way for any voter to really move things around is to be incredibly persuasive. And the only way to do that in the context in which we work is to make really strong arguments based on the data and one's understanding of the economy. That's really all that matters. And that's how it's going to work. And I think that is the way the institution, that's in the DNA of the institution. That's not going to change.
And then I wanted to ask about a Gallup poll that showed that Americans now have more confidence in the president than the Federal Reserve when it comes to doing what's right for the economy. Why do you think that is, and what's your response? What's your message to the public?
Our response is we're going to do everything we can to use our tools to achieve the goals that Congress has given us, and we're not going to get distracted by anything. So I think that's what we're going to do. We're just going to keep doing our jobs.
Claire Jones, Financial Times. Given the range of views expressed prior to the meeting, I think there was a lot less dissent today than a lot of people expected. It'd be good to know just what you think the drivers were of coming to that very strong consensus in the meeting, and also on the flip side to just explain why the dot plots are really so scattered between, someone even expecting rates to end up higher by the end of the year to 5 cuts. I mean, what were the kind of range of views you heard about, on one side, why there was so much support for a cut today, and on the flip side, why there's so much divergence about what comes next?
So I think there's quite a wide assessment that the situation has changed with respect to the labor market. Whereas we could still say, and did say in July, at the time of the July meeting, that the labor market was in solid condition, and we could point to 150,000 jobs per month.
पॉपकॉर्न मंगा रहा हूं मैं ताकि पावेल को देख के पॉपकॉर्न खाए. पावेल को देखते देखते पॉपकॉर्न खाए और चिल मारे. ठीक है, डन. चलो, डन. गर्मी लग रहा है क्या भाई? अभी रुक जाओ, तुम्हें भी लगेगी गर्मी. एक ट्रेड लेना भी 11:30 को. यू विल अंडरस्टैंड. डन. ओके, चलो. लास्ट $7 आर या पार? मुझे भाई ऑलरेडी पार हो चुके हो. अभी कितना ऑलरेडी आर हो चुके हो. क्या बचा है $7 के साथ? ट्रेड लेते सी ब्रोकर ही बोल देगा भाई तू गरीब है, निकल यहाँ से, तेरा ट्रेड ही नहीं लूंगा मैं. गिव अवे इंडिकेटर प्लीज सर. सॉरी ब्रो, अगर मैं फ्री में देते रहूंगा तो जिसने मेहनत करके प्रोसेस पूरा करके लिया है उसके लिए अनफेयर होगा. Let's gamble, bro. Okay, guys, are you ready? 3 minutes to go. Gold or BTC? Everyone is saying gold. Everyone is saying gold. Okay, guys. Okay, guys, ready. So देखो 2 मिनट बचा है. 2 मिनट बचा है एंड प्राइस एक्शन तो दिख रहा है, सपोर्ट वीक सेलिंग है, गोल्ड का ओवरऑल जो बायस है बुलिश है ओवरऑल बट सपोर्ट पे कुछ नहीं बोला जा सकता भाई। तो मैं जितना ऑब्जर्व कर रहा हूँ, ये देखो सेलर्स को इनविटेशन दिया जा रहा है, तो ये सारी शॉर्ट कवरिंग होके मार्केट ऊपर पंप हो सकता है। एंड एग्जैक्ट मैं टारगेट भी बताऊँ, एग्जैक्ट यहाँ से रिजेक्शन लेगा, अगर ऊपर फटता भी एग्जैक्ट यहाँ से रिजेक्शन लेगा। बट अगेन हम गैमलिंग नहीं करेंगे, ये देखो प्रॉफिट मिलेगा, बट क्या है ना कि ये रेंज है, अगर नीचे से रिजेक्शन लेता है तो मेरे पास प्लान रेडी है, अगर डायरेक्ट ऊपर ले जाता है तो कुछ नहीं कर सकते। 1 मिनट, ठीक है। एक बार अपन लेवल बना देते हैं 82। ओके गाइस, 1 मिनट टू गो। वन मिनट टू गो, 1 मिनट भी हो गया, 40 सेकेंड्स, 30 सेकेंड्स गाइस। देखो मैं क्या सोच रहा हूँ, अगर देखो अभी